welcome once again. I believe that this second presentation will be exciting for you. For so long, Marxism has critiqued the foundations of the West. Now the time has come for us to consider the foundations of Marxism. Were the atrocities in communism's history an accident, or were they a result of the Marxist ideology? As you listen to Bill's presentation, please decide for yourself.
Marx spoke about the alienation of the laborer from the product of his labor. So we might ask, is the Soviet worker the owner of what he produces? Has he overcome that particular problem of alienation? Of course we know he is not. A new elite has emerged within the Soviet Union. The power, the control of the means of production has been consolidated in the hands of a very few people. In fact, Marx, who used the word capitalism, by capitalism he meant a system where there were a few people who controlled everything and did nothing. And then there were a few people who did everything, did all the work, but had no control, had no ownership. Strictly speaking, although we may use the word capitalism, perhaps carelessly, for Marx it had a very definite meaning. And we don't really find that kind of capitalism anywhere in our world. However, the closest thing to it is what we find in the Soviet Union today, where there are a very small number of people who control not only the means of production, they control the military, they control the entire infrastructure of the country, and they even control the official ideology. So really, the Soviet worker is certainly not the owner of what he produces. This particular elite group, here characterized by Mr. Chernenko, is well-to-do. They're able to shop in special stores where they can buy things from the West. However, in general, the Soviet Union is not characterized by wealth, but rather is characterized by widespread poverty. In his text, USSR in Crisis, Marshall I. Goldman, Associate Director of the Russian Research Center at Harvard University, points out that Russia was formerly the greatest exporter of grain in the world. But under the communist system, Russia has become an importer of grain. Goldman looks at other indicators of economic prosperity, such as the annual rate of growth of the GNP. And he finds that every year, the Soviet GNP grows less and less. Under communism, the country is becoming less and less prosperous. This has given rise to a very curious irony. And that is that there are two functioning economies in the Soviet Union. There is the official Marxist-based economy, and there is an underground free market system. In other words, a clandestine free market system without which the country could not sustain itself. In this article, which appeared in Forbes magazine, which Tom mentioned, authors Lawrence Menard and James Michaels point out that the average subsistence wage necessary for a Soviet worker to maintain himself and his family is 210 rubles a month. But the average take-home pay of the Soviet worker is only 171 rubles a month. And because of this, they say, almost every Soviet worker has to maintain a second job, some kind of illegal job participating in this illegal free market that is operating in the Soviet Union. In fact, in the Soviet Union every day, people are committing crimes such as buying, selling, transporting. Things that are just the normal business of the day in the free world are, of course, criminal activities in the Soviet Union, and they are regarded as exploitation of someone else. This gives rise to a situation which is perhaps captured in a little anecdote that I could share with you. There were some Western working men who went over to the Soviet Union and were visiting the Soviet Union. And the Soviets, of course, were very curious about these people from the West. So they were asking some of these workers about their income and things like that. And they said, they asked one particular person, how much do you make a month? And this person said, well, I make about $1,000 a month. And he said, well, how much of that do you need just in order to survive? And he thought, and he said, well, I guess just in order to survive, I need about $800 a month. And so the Soviet worker was surprised. And he said, well, what do you do with all that extra money every month? And the Westerner said, well, actually, where I come from, we don't usually ask that kind of question to a complete stranger. That's sort of a personal affair. He said, how about you? How much do you make a month? And the Soviet said, well, I make 200 rubles a month. And the American said, well, how much do you need just in order to survive? And he said, well, I need about 275 rubles a month. And the American was surprised. He said, well, where do you get that extra 75 rubles every month? And the Soviet said, well, in my country, we don't usually talk about that with a complete stranger. So the fact is, there is an illegal, clandestine, free market system that actually even the Soviet Union couldn't sustain itself without some kind of free enterprise system going on. However, it's strictly illegal. If we're looking for alienation of the laborer from the product of his labor, we're going to find it in its most extreme form, where there's this attempt to apply Marxist principles. Marx talked about the alienation of the laborer from his laboring activity itself. Well, then in that case, does the Soviet worker derive joy and satisfaction from his work? It certainly appears that he doesn't. In fact, we know that the Soviet system is based upon forced labor. In other words, the ruler, such as Andropov, may come and may exhort the workers to work, may appeal to the workers to work, as he did repeatedly. However, if they don't work, there's ultimately the possibility of being sent to the Gulag, which serves not only as a threat of punishment, but actually serves as an additional supply of cheap or free labor for the society. Furthermore, the Soviet system is characterized by quotas. Quotas for production, quotas for consumption, all different kinds of quotas which very quickly become meaningless. They must be fulfilled. If they're not fulfilled, it's an act against the state. So they have to be fulfilled, at least on paper, even if they're not fulfilled in reality. So they very quickly become meaningless. In fact, in Goldman's book, he talks about various instances of meaningless quotas, such as a particular truck repair facility that was actually built to replace an existing truck repair facility. So the new facility was completed, it was inspected, it was found to be safe from fire, it passed the health inspection, and the trucks that needed repair were diverted from the old plant to the new plant. However, after a number of months, these trucks began to pile up in the parking lot because the new plant didn't exist. It only existed on paper, even though it had been inspected many times. And ultimately, this was even reported in Pravda, and they had to admit and expose their own foolishness in this affair. Ultimately, in a recent report of the Soviet Academy of Sciences, they discussed the question why workers won't work in the Soviet Union. While the Soviet economic malaise has been attributed by various Soviet scholars to different factors, such as lagging investment, flagging work discipline, harder mining conditions, or dry years in agriculture, the conclusion of the Soviet Academy of Science itself is that there lies in the outdated nature of the system of organization and economic management, or simply in the inability of the system to ensure complete and efficient utilization of the workers and of the intellectual potential of the society. The Soviet-style system doesn't mobilize human creativity, doesn't allow for the release of the natural human creativity. In fact, there's a slogan amongst the workers in the Soviet Union reported in this article. There's a saying among the workers, they pretend to pay us and we pretend to work, summing up the situation of the Soviet worker. Other dissidents, such as Mr. Mikhail Makarenko, whom I mentioned, report that it's not just a passive thing. There is an active revolution that has been taking place since 1917 within the Soviet Union. But it's not a military revolution. It's rather a revolution of sabotage. Mr. Makarenko says that the average Soviet worker goes to work every day thinking, what can I do to sabotage the government industry today? What valve can I leave open? What part can I steal and throw in the river? What can I do to just bog down the industrial production of the Soviet Union? That this becomes the expression of discontent. Of course, any sort of organized expression of labor dissatisfaction is harshly repressed. And in the workers' paradise, workers are not allowed to organize and to express their grievances. In short, if we look for alienation of the laborer from his laboring activity, we may find it everywhere, but we will find it in its most extreme form where someone is trying dogmatically to apply Marxist principles. Marx talked about the alienation of the human species, but we may ask, does man find his true human nature in the Soviet system? There are reports of incredible widespread corruption in the Soviet Union. A recent Soviet Academy report says, the type of worker that such a system cultivates not only falls short of the needs of developed socialism, but fails to match the requirements of modern production. His common traits are low labor and productive discipline, an indifferent attitude toward work, a shoddy quality of work, social inactivity, a well-pronounced consumer mentality of all things, and a low code of ethics. In this text called USSR, the Corrupt Society, ex-defense attorney for the in the Soviet Union, Konstantin Simis, talks about the widespread corruption found in the Soviet Union. To give you a little flavor of Simis's book, let me just read a couple of paragraphs. Simis talks about the special problem in fighting organized crime in the Soviet Union. He says, the fight against organized crime has always presented major difficulties for any state in whatever political system. In a democratic country such as the United States, the difficulties stem from a respect for legality and the basic principles of justice. The police know the heads of the mafia families and their whereabouts, but they do not have sufficient evidence to submit to a court of law in order that criminal proceedings might be instituted. In a totalitarian state like the Soviet Union, on the other hand, the fight against organized crime encounters quite different obstacles. Obstacles that stem from the fact that crime has practically enveloped the whole country and the entire lower levels of the party-state apparatus. In another point in the book, he writes, although not conceived as such by its creators, this Soviet variety of organized crime naturally is derived from and has become an organic part of the dictatorship of the apparat of the only political party in the country, the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. Organized crime in the Soviet Union bears the stamp of the Soviet political system, the Soviet economy, and in general, everything that may be lumped together as the Soviet regime. The final passage of Simis's book is this. And now, finishing this book, I ask myself, what next? What is the future of the country? And I answer my own question with bitterness. The Soviet government, Soviet society cannot rid itself of corruption as long as it remains Soviet. It's as simple as that. So, this supposedly sincere application of Marxist principles has done nothing in terms of resolving the problem of how does man find his true human nature. And finally, Marx lamented the separation of man from man. But are the citizen workers of the Soviet Union able to establish fulfilling and joyful human relationships? It's inconceivable that in a society characterized by constant surveillance, even the surveillance of children against their parents, this would be possible. Furthermore, we know the Soviet Union is characterized by elitism and racism. Actually, the Soviet Union is a vast empire, including the Great Russians and many subservient states. And yet, the Politburo is almost a homogeneous group of the same race and a certain elite group which perpetuates itself. Communism is supposed to solve problems of nationalism. And yet, one of the most heavily fortified international frontiers in the world is the international boundary between the Soviet Union and Communist China, two communist countries. Furthermore, probably the most damning evidence against the Soviet system and all the communist countries is the mass exodus which takes place whenever communists come to power. It's said that when the Berlin Wall was being constructed, behind every worker with a shovel was a soldier with a gun. And behind every soldier with a gun was another soldier with a gun. And yet, probably many of you remember the celebrated photo of this soldier who took his chances and ran across when the wall was just a roll of barbed wire. Now the wall is much more than just a wall. In fact, I had the opportunity to visit the city of Berlin last year as a part of a fact-finding tour, and we found the wall is an incredible complex of devices. There's the wall. Behind the wall there are minefields, there are anti-tank traps, there are special sand pits, there are automatic rifle traps that when the wires trip, they'll automatically fire. There are police dogs, and there are even machine gun nests manned by soldiers. It's the most dramatic evidence of the failure of the communist world, the social failure of communism. The fact that literally the communist world is a great prison in which its citizens are retained by force. By the way, you may be aware that the wall, when it was constructed, was known as an anti-fascist protective rampart by the East German authorities. Perhaps the situation of the Vietnamese boat people is the most poignant example. After all, Vietnam has suffered the scourge of war for decades, if not centuries. One war or another, one type of aggression or another. And even the Vietnam War in which we were involved, in which the United States was involved, brought a tremendous amount of destruction and suffering to the population, but the people did not leave their country. They did not abandon their native soil until the nation fell to communism. Then they began to leave, even if it meant just venturing out in fragile boats with no guarantees of safety or security, even when they would reach the free world or a free world shipping vessel. Of course, there's been a romantic idea, unfortunately, that somehow in the Western Hemisphere, for example, Fidel Castro's brand of communism was somehow different, progressive, and something good for the people. Now, of course, report after report is filtering out of Cuba about what communism under Fidel Castro really is, and it's classic Stalinistic communism. This is Armando Valladares' text, Prisoner of Castro, which was published in France in 1979. This is a Spanish version. I've yet to see the English version, actually. It's a book of poetry that was composed during his 22 years in Castro's prison because he opposed the Castro regime. Where do we find the alienation of man from man? Well, perhaps we find it everywhere, but we find a most intense, devastating type of alienation where the communist program is actually being practiced. 66 years of experiment. Has communism worked? Well, Marx felt that the workers in Paris were unfortunate when he was in Paris in 1844. But I'm sure that any one of the workers in the Soviet Union would trade places today with those workers that Marx met in the cafes of Paris. The situation in the Soviet Union can perhaps be symbolized by a black limousine, probably belonging to one of the Soviet elite, cruising by a poster of Marx and Engels. In fact, communism is a tragic social failure. Why is that? Is it simply a question of the mismanagement by a few leaders? Is it the failure of effective leadership? Is it perhaps misinterpretation of Marxist theory? We have to answer no to those questions. After all, whether we look at the regimes established by Lenin, Stalin, Mao Zedong, Kim Il-sung, Pol Pot in Cambodia, or Heng Samrin, who displaced him, Fidel Castro, or the Ortegas in Nicaragua, wherever we look, when we see that Marxism-Leninism gains control and is put into practice, we find the same type of practice. The problem is not coming from these sorts of factors, but the problem is stemming out of the theory of Marxism itself. So we'll spend the remaining moments of this particular presentation discussing the 4 fundamental errors of Marxist theory. The first error is the most basic. It involves a misconception of what the universe is all about, what the universe is actually composed of. According to Marx, matter is the essence of the universe. The universe is essentially composed of matter, and it has always existed. Of course, stemming out of this is the denial of God. There's no God. Even more than this, there's a denial of something very fundamental in science, and that is the concept that cause precedes effect. and that there's an orderly relationship between cause and effect, that you can't have an effect without a cause. This is the basis of the ontological argument for the existence of God. It's also the fundamental underlying principle for all of science, that something that's achieved in one laboratory today can be reproduced in another laboratory tomorrow. But the concept that the universe is uncaused is a challenge to that fundamental relationship of cause and effect. Furthermore, the denial of God means the denial of absolute values. There are only relative values in the Marxist world, values which must be established by human beings in order to pursue their particular ends. But we challenge this view that matter is the essence of the universe. First of all, we affirm that fundamentally the existence of God is a question of faith. Marxism seems to take the position that science destroys religion, that science is the enemy of religion and will ultimately dispose of religion and belief in God altogether. However, even science cannot intrude into the domain of faith. And this is where the important question of God's existence ultimately resides. Marx himself cannot intrude into that domain because it is a question of faith. Furthermore, there is considerable logical, scientific, and experiential evidence that God does exist. And we're going to talk more about that when we expound on the causal worldview. However, for now, let's just summarize some of that evidence. There are the arguments of reason, the so-called proofs of God, which people have dealt with for centuries. People have been diving into and exploring the various logical statements and proofs that can be made about God. This is simply a list or a grouping, a classification of some of those proofs, beginning with the ontological proof of St. Anselm, and going on through the cosmological, teleological, moral proof, experiential proof, inductive proof based on confirmation theory. I'm not going to spend the time to get into all these. Some people do. They are fascinated by it. In fact, maybe you've seen this book, Does God Exist?, by the German theologian Hans Küng. Actually, this was a bestseller in Germany. I don't know how it did in the United States. But here's a book that is 840 pages long, examining all these different arguments and proofs and whether or not God exists and so forth. Well, you don't have to read the book, actually. Don't rush out and buy it. All you have to do is look at the last page and find out what conclusion Mr. Küng ultimately came to. So we'll sneak ahead, and we find that Hans Küng comes up with this. The question, does God exist, can now be answered by a clear, convinced yes, justifiable at the bar of critical reason. Good. No need to wade through 840 pages of argument. The point is this: what Marx would like to dismiss with a wave of his hand is actually a considerable amount of careful reasoning into the question of God's existence. So much so that this particular investigator, after 840 pages, concludes that by reason alone, you can defend the existence of God. Then there's a whole another category. That would be modern scientific evidence. We might mention particle physics, which we'll talk a little bit about later in the causal worldview. Thermodynamics, genetics, quantum mechanics, molecular biology. Each one of these fields has something to say about the existence of God. Of course, science does not prove God's existence, but science can take us forward, we might say, to the threshold of understanding about God. Let's take one example. When Marx looked at the world, he saw only matter. However, we observe in the universe the progressive development of organisms from lower to higher states of complexity, differentiation, and organization, finally arriving at human beings. This process, this developmental trend, can generally be called the process of evolution, or the process of development. But if we try to explain this process from a strictly materialistic viewpoint, in other words, if we are just associated with, if we're just familiar with the chemistry and physics of the laboratory, and we look at something like this, we would definitely come to the conclusion that this should never occur. The laws of thermodynamics, which discuss entropy, say that you can never get into a higher state of organization unless you put some input in. In other words, they suggest, although not in the form of a rigorous scientific proof, but there's a very strong suggestion that order, organization, energy is being added while this process is taking place. That a real look at evolutionary thought from the point of view of the laws of chemistry and physics strongly suggests to us that a creator is indeed working to create life. Again, I don't proclaim this as a rigorous scientific proof, since I've already said that that's impossible. But I would say, again, it takes us to the threshold of really a proof of God. Even some of you who've heard the lectures before, heard the Causa seminar before, you notice that there's always a slight rearrangement or some new slides. I couldn't help but think, as I was working on the slides for this seminar, really I can testify that even just to modify the slides a little bit and try to make it a little bit better requires an investment of energy. The arrangement will never just become better by itself. It involves getting suggestions, doing more research, just even to make the lecture flow a little bit smoother. Then we come to the, basically we could say, preposterous position that something like a human being could come as a product of chance. Actually, science tends to argue against it, contrary to what Marxism suggests. However, reason, science can teach us something, but ultimately we depend upon our personal experience, our personal feeling, intuitive feeling, as to where the human being comes from. Where does this complex being, which is us, which we can study on a physical level, and we can study even the psyche of the human being. And ultimately we end up with a very strong feeling that this is coming from somewhere. And this has led the great religionists and the great spiritualists to believe that the human being is a creation of God. Finally, to return to Marxist materialism, Marxist materialism is a type of hoax. Now, before I used such a strong word, I decided to check the dictionary definition of hoax. After all, I didn't want to say it if I couldn't back it up. So Webster's dictionary defines hoax as to trick into believing or accepting as genuine something false and often preposterous. When I see that definition, I just feel very sure that Marxist materialism is a hoax. Marx is claiming that science is with him. He's also claiming that he knows something that is really unknowable. And those who follow down that path find themselves believing something that is ultimately preposterous. However, I'll leave it at that. The causal worldview with regard to this question is based on the affirmation that there is a first cause, God, and that God created according to a purpose and a plan, that he created according to laws and principles, and that if we don't take into account those laws and principles and that overriding purpose, then our various programs and plans are going to come to frustration. Furthermore, the existence of God means the possibility of absolute values. And we'll talk more about a basic theme of this conference, and that is the elevation of the human perspective to a good, clear perspective of what is valuable and what is not, an absolute value perspective. In any case, let's move on. The second error stems out of the first. Because of his misunderstanding of the origin and nature of the universe, Marx was led to conclude that a human being is nothing but an economic animal, that the human essence is material, and that the human nature is an accidental product of evolution. We recall that the Marxist view of man, as it was elaborated by Engels and approved by Marx, or at least Marx had no objection to it, is based on Lamarckism, the concept of the inheritance of acquired characteristics. In other words, the species, the nature of the species results from the external conditions around it. So the human nature results from the external conditions. In order to change the human nature, simply change the external conditions. This was the thinking of Pol Pot. When the very day, April 17th, 1975, when Phnom Penh fell, he began an evacuation of millions of people. He wanted to change their external conditions and to recreate them as new communist people. And he ended up killing perhaps 50% of the people in the country. Some estimates are that high. Needless to say, this view of a human being really offers no basis for human rights. No fundamental philosophical basis. Even though, according to the rules of Leninism, a Marxist can take whatever sort of position is advantageous at the moment. So many times Marxist-Leninists will be the champions of human rights. But there's, in this view of man as an economic animal, where's the foundation? Where's the support for a view of human rights? Where do rights come from? When Leninism is practiced, rights are simply bestowed upon the individual by the state if he cooperates with the state program. This view of a human being led to Marx's false view of human alienation. He views man as an economic animal. Therefore, alienation is an economic phenomenon. This is the materialistic view. And the materialistic solution is legal and political. Actually, it involves the overthrow of the existing economic relations and the key negation of private property relations. The external diagnosis produces an external treatment which really doesn't get down to the real core of the problem. In fact, if we look at the theories of evolution, we must take into account that Lamarckism, the basis for the Marxist view of man, has fallen into disrepute. In fact, this idea that the organism interacts with the environment and changes and passes that on to offspring, the transmission of acquired characteristics, has been completely discredited by modern science. We might go so far as to say proven false. Some of you are probably familiar with the Soviet geneticist Lysenko, who based all kinds of extraordinary claims on Lamarckism. He said that he had developed new hybrid forms of wheat using Lamarckian principles. And anyone who opposed him was punished in the true Soviet style. However, Lysenko ultimately became exposed as his theories are completely devoid of fact, and he fell into disrepute. It's a very interesting segment of the history of Soviet science. And of course, Lamarck and Lysenko went down together. Today, the scientific world is very interested in the theories of Darwin. And the view of Darwin is that change occurs, first of all, in the reproductive mechanism. In other words, it's not the environmental pressure which causes the change. It has to do with the genetic code. Darwin wasn't familiar with the genetic code. Today we understand about the genetic code. Then there is the process of natural selection. However, even Darwinism is still being evaluated. It may be in vogue at the present time, but there are certainly dissenting views against Darwinism. Two-time Nobel Prize winner Dr. Svend Georgi compares the idea of Darwinistic evolution to the idea that I could drop my watch on the floor and that if a few parts became bent somehow randomly, I might end up with a better watch. He says it's preposterous that you would have to design a new watch and you'd have to create the entire watch at once because the parts are interrelated to one another. You cannot just change one part or another part. You have to change the entire mechanism. So there's a two-time Nobel Prize winner, and of course his prizes were in the field of biology, challenging very much the Darwinistic view. There's the possibility today of a tremendous breakthrough in evolutionary science. In fact, it's interesting to compare evolutionary science today to the science of physics at the turn of the century. Physics, before Einstein, was thought to be a dead science. Not dead, but a complete science. In fact, the great British physicist Rutherford was trying to decide which branch of science to go into, and he was advised, stay away from physics, there's nothing left to discover. And that was at the beginning of the 20th century. However, it turned out there were a few things still left to discover. And when those things were investigated, the whole realm of the new physics, or modern physics, opened up. And we'll have some more to say about that later in the conference. However, simply by comparison, Darwinism looks like it has things locked up. But there are still even some areas which continue to be investigated. Perhaps we'll see a revolution in evolutionary science the same way we saw a revolution in physics. In any case, Lamarckism, which is the basis of the Marxist view, has been discredited by scientific investigation. The causal worldview then begins by affirming that human beings are created by God, and that this original human nature, or so-called human species essence, comes from God. This is in accordance with the religious tradition, that God created the human beings in His image and likeness. This provides a basis, a philosophical basis for human rights, that they are given by God, that they are, as the documents of which the Founding Fathers produced, that they are inalienable rights given by God. Furthermore, human nature is, we might say, spiritual and physical. And it is not the case that the spirit is simply a product of the physical. That in fact, human beings have this internal dimension and external dimension. And that some of the things which are most important to us are the internal qualities, the striving after truth, goodness, ultimately the need for love, the striving after love, which becomes perhaps the most important fundamental human need. Perhaps every mother knows this, that what the baby requires most are not just the external necessities of food and so forth, but that even that child cannot develop properly if the child does not receive love. This is not to deny the importance of the external aspect, but the irony is that Marxism, which focuses completely on the external, produces a system which cannot satisfy either dimension. So we would hope that by understanding that the internal is most important, we can come up with a system that can provide for both. Finally, although it's cut off at the bottom, there's an implication as regards alienation. That alienation is not, as Marx said, simply an economic phenomenon, but rather, as the religious tradition affirms, the fundamental problem of alienation has to do with a disruption of the relationship between man and God. In other words, that the relationship between man and God has been disturbed. Whether we call this the original sin, the fall of man, there are many, many words. But the religious view affirms that this is the cause. This is the root cause of alienation, and then it has its manifestations in all the walks of human life. This view supports all forms of religious seeking for God. Of course, each religion has its own doctrine of salvation. Even the various denominations of Christianity have different doctrines of salvation. But all in common try to understand the nature of the Creator and try to reconcile man with God. Then, the third error of Marxism. According to Marx, simply put, conflict brings progress. Dialectical materialism pits one element against another. And Marxism will always advocate confrontation, the exacerbation of disagreements. It will always foment a face-off, a showdown, and a violent resolution. However, dialectical materialism is a tremendous distortion of reality. The dialectic was taken from Hegel. Hegel had developed an idea regarding the progress of thought. That if you and I simply agree, we don't progress in our thinking, that there has to be some kind of challenge and critique and disagreement, and then we go on to greater levels of thought. But Marx took this dialectic out of the realm of ideas and force-fit it into his materialistic framework. But it produces absurdities, such as this example taken from the Marxist philosophy textbook of the Soviet Union. It reads, an atom, for example, could not exist without the interaction, the struggle of the positively charged nucleus and the negatively charged electrons. Struggle between protons and electrons. But this is a tremendous distortion of reality. And it's designed to justify violent action in order to carry society forward. In reality, we find that violent process is not necessary for progress. In fact, Engels, who wrote the texts Anti-Düring and Dialectic of Nature, he pretended to see the dialectic everywhere, all around in the universe. But if we look at the relationship, for example, between proton and electron, is it really a struggling, conflictive relationship that produces the atom? Is it a struggle and conflict between stamen and pistil that produces the seed? In fact, it's not. First of all, there's a common purpose. And this is the key point. If two things have an overlapping or common purpose, then the relationship that they enter into is not a conflicting relationship. It is a relationship of giving and receiving. So we can talk about subject and object elements. The word subject and object here should not be misunderstood. It simply means one initiates and the other responds. So unless there's cooperation, unless there's initiation and response based upon a common purpose, there's never any progress. Now, we're not saying that the proton has a certain purpose in mind, but obviously the purpose of the creator is being fulfilled through the relationship between proton and electron, through stamen and pistil. It's only when we get to the human level that we find that the various parties can have their own purposes. So human beings can actually conceive of purposes. And when those purposes bring us together in a cooperative way, there's progress. For example, the causa seminar. There could not be a causa seminar if everyone here, inclusive, did not feel that they were going to gain something. I'd venture to say that no one would be in the room unless they felt they could benefit from it. This is the nature of cooperation, cooperative effort. When there is contradictory purpose, then there's a tendency to repel, and no relationship is made. But progress does not come that way. Marx, as we'll talk about later this afternoon, his emphasis on conflict is basically missing the boat. He's describing a secondary process. Really, our view is existence, progress, and development can only occur through purposeful, harmonious interaction. Finally, the fourth error, according to Marx, history is a series of class struggles which will culminate in communism. Marx said that all the significant events of history involve class struggles, and the final class struggle would be between the proletariat and bourgeoisie, that this would produce socialism, and that socialism would be such a wonderful method of social organization, and it would produce so much wealth that eventually distribution would only be made on the basis of need, and socialism would turn into communism, and communism would come about. However, we have several comments about this point of view, which we'll elaborate on later. The class struggle is not the major factor in historical development. Of course there have been class struggles, but there have been many other types of struggle as well. And many times those have been key and important struggles in history. Furthermore, Marxism adopts a Hegelian point of view that history is already determined, is already lined up at what's going to happen, and that human beings really don't have free will or free choice in the matter. But what we find is that human beings have free will, and along with that free will, they have responsibility. If that responsibility is not fulfilled, history doesn't move, doesn't progress. Now, in fact, in Marxism, we find a serious ambiguity about this subject. There are a number of serious ambiguities in Marxism, but one of the most interesting regards free will. On the one hand, human beings have no choice in the matter. There's these economic, material laws are just operating, and history is going forward, and no one has any choice. But then on the other hand, we find that Marxism is like a call to action. It's actually a religion. It actually tries to inspire its followers to act. So it appears on one hand as if there's no free will. It appears on the other hand as if each person is challenged to freely choose to take communism forward. It's a very serious philosophical ambiguity which is not resolved in the writings of Marx or Marxists. Finally, we say that history is not moving toward communist utopia. This is not just an opinion, but we can make a certain linguistic analysis here and show that this is a fact. What does communism mean? What do we mean when we use the word communism? Generally, we use it as a synonym for Marxism-Leninism. In that sense, communism as a program, Marxism-Leninism, is a social failure. It does not bring forth a utopia. But there's another sense of the word communism, because communism also represents an ideal, the so-called workers' paradise. Strictly speaking, according to Soviet ideology, the Soviet Union has not reached communism yet. It's still in the socialism stage. It's still moving towards communism. But then what is communism as an ideal? It is a myth. In fact, it's an irrational myth. It cannot be supported by reason, by reasonable arguments. Marx, of course, he took the position of a great opponent of mythologies. and a great advocate of reason. And yet his communism, we find at its very bottom, is not supported by reason and has to fall into the category of religious faith or myth, to use his sort of word. The real cause of conflict in this worldview stems out of an internal struggle that is going on within human beings. And this is the struggle that the great philosophers and religionists have talked about. The struggle between virtue and vice, or between good and evil, or between, ultimately, selfishness and unselfishness. Now this becomes a key word in our view, because by selfishness we do not mean the desire to improve oneself. That is a part of human nature. What we mean by selfishness can best be understood, or can perhaps be understood through this definition: lack of a proper value perspective, a narrow, limited view of what will bring benefit to a person. If we consider it this way, we find that selfishness is at the root of all the various manifestations of social evil. A narrow, rigid view of self-benefit is responsible for racism, for corruption, for abuse of the environment, for sacrificing the next generation's environment for this generation's gain, for exploitation itself. Actually, Marxism raises a tremendous rallying cry against exploitation. But exploitation is only one manifestation of a fundamental problem of selfishness, confusion in values. And Marxism doesn't have the capacity, doesn't have the philosophical content to resolve the problem of selfishness. Therefore, we find tremendous exploitation applied under Marxist governments. The causal worldview then offers and develops a different view of history, based on the existence of God, and based on the belief that God created with a purpose, that God will not abandon or change that purpose, but that God will rather guide history towards the fulfillment of that purpose. Nevertheless, man is created as a free actor in history, able to make choices. God does not operate in a coercive way. God seeks to inspire, and that this is the true function of religion, to inspire human beings, and that in no case will God coerce or force human beings. Therefore, the human being has a tremendous responsibility in history. History is not completely determined, as Marxism suggests, but more as Toynbee would have envisioned it, that man finds himself in challenging situations, and that is the human response to those challenges which determines whether history goes forward or not. This constitutes a very quick, brief, and general overview of Marxist ideology, how it has resulted in the tremendous social failure which is communism today, and how that social failure is not just a product of accident or misapplication, but that the Marxist theory and ideology itself is doomed to social failure when it's applied.
Thank you, Bill. I think that you will agree that we now have somewhat of a panoramic view of Marxism. We understand something of Marxist theory and something of its fallacies. In the following 3 presentations, we will deal with these matters in greater detail. I believe that after these 3 presentations, you will know more about communist theory than most communists do. Please join us.